September 1991. Mountain Studios, Montreux. Freddie Mercury and Brian May sat together during a break in one of their final recording sessions. And Freddie, according to the account Brian has given across the limited interviews where he has addressed this specific afternoon at all, said something that Brian has described as unlike any other statement Freddie made across the entirety of his illness. A specific and unusually precise claim, rather than the general acknowledgement of mortality that had, by that point, become a quiet but consistent undercurrent in many of their conversations. He said, according to Brian's most detailed account of the exchange, offered decades later in an interview conducted specifically around questions of Freddie's final months, "I know the date, Brian. Not roughly, not approximately. I know the actual date. I'm not going to tell you how I know, because I don't fully understand it myself, but I know, and I need you to know that I know, even if I never tell you what it is." Brian has said, across every account he has given of this exchange, that his immediate reaction involved a specific kind of disbelief. Not disbelief that Freddie might have some private sense of his own approaching death, a sense that Brian understood. By that point in Freddie's illness, many terminally ill people reportedly experience in some form, but disbelief at the specific claim of exact knowledge, the assertion of a precise date, rather than a general feeling or approximate window. Brian asked, according to his account, whether Freddie meant he had received some specific medical prognosis with unusual precision, a piece of information from his doctors that might account for this, claimed certainty. And Freddie's response, according to every version of this account Brian has offered, explicitly rejected this explanation, insisting that his claimed knowledge had nothing to do with anything his doctors had told him, that it came from somewhere else entirely, a source Freddie apparently declined to specify beyond the acknowledgement that he himself didn't fully understand its origin or its reliability, only that he felt, with what Brian has described as an unsettling and complete conviction, that the specific date existed and that he knew it. Brian has said that his next question, the obvious follow-up given everything Freddie had just claimed, was simply to ask what the date actually was. And Freddie's refusal to answer this direct question has become, across the decades since, the specific detail around which this entire story turns. Freddie apparently declining to share the actual date with anyone, including Brian, despite having gone to the trouble of raising the subject at all and insisting, with unusual force, that Brian understand he possessed this specific knowledge even while withholding its content. "Why tell me you know if you won't tell me what it is?" Brian has recounted asking. According to the version of this exchange that has proven most consistent across his different retellings, and Freddie's answer, delivered according to Brian's account with a specific calm that Brian found more unsettling than any visible distress might have been, addressed a logic that Brian has said took him considerable time, extending well beyond Freddie's actual death, to fully understand or accept. Because if I tell you the date, you'll spend whatever time is left watching the calendar instead of watching me. You'll start counting down instead of just being here. I don't want that. I want you to know that I know, so you understand I'm not afraid of it, that I've made my peace with a specific ending rather than an abstract one. But the actual date is mine. It's the one thing that's completely mine, that nobody else gets to carry or worry about or wait for. I need to keep that. Brian has described this explanation as one of the more difficult things he has ever had to simply accept without further argument, understanding, even in the moment according to his own account, that pressing Freddie further would have violated something Freddie clearly considered essential to how he wanted to manage his own remaining time, a specific and deliberate boundary that Brian chose. In that conversation, and in every year since, to respect completely rather than attempting to extract through further questioning or persistence. Freddie Mercury died on the 24th of November, 1991, and the question of whether that date corresponded to whatever specific date Freddie had claimed to know back in September. Whether he had in fact correctly anticipated the actual day of his own death with the precision he had insisted upon during that earlier conversation has never been directly addressed by Brian in any interview where this story has come up. Brian consistently declining, across every documented instance where the subject has arisen, to confirm or deny whether November 24th matched whatever Freddie had originally claimed to know, maintaining instead the same careful and complete discretion regarding the date's specific content that he has maintained regarding every other aspect of this particular exchange. This specific refusal, extending even to the seemingly simple question of whether the actual date of death matched Freddie's claimed foreknowledge, has generated, among people who have encountered this story, its own layer of intense speculation. The recognition that Brian's continued silence on even this comparatively basic point of confirmation suggests either that the actual answer remains, for Brian personally, too emotionally significant to address even in the abstract, or that Freddie's original claim of foreknowledge, whatever its ultimate accuracy, has itself become, through Brian's continued protective silence, a permanently sealed piece of private testimony that Brian has apparently decided belongs entirely to the specific afternoon when it was first shared, regardless of how that claimed knowledge ultimately measured against subsequent events. What makes this particular story distinct from other similarly structured accounts of Freddie's final year premonitions and private acknowledgments of his approaching death is the specific and unusual precision of the original claim. Most documented testimony from this period involving general statements about mortality, exhaustion, or approximate timelines, rather than anything resembling the specific exact date certainty Freddie reportedly claimed during this particular September conversation, a distinction that has led some people who have studied this story closely to treat it with somewhat more skepticism than similarly unverified accounts from this period. The recognition that claims of precise supernatural or intuitive foreknowledge tend to attract more scrutiny than general statements about accepting one's own mortality, which align more straightforwardly with well-documented psychological patterns among people facing terminal illness. Brian himself, according to the limited commentary he has offered on this broader question, has acknowledged this specific tension in how he has chosen to discuss the exchange, noting, in at least one interview, that he understands why some listeners might find the claim of precise foreknowledge difficult to accept at face value, while maintaining, consistently across every account he has given, that he has never doubted the sincerity of Freddie's belief in that moment, regardless of whatever objective mechanism, if any, might have actually underlain it. I'm not asking anyone to believe he genuinely knew the future, Brian has said, according to the version of this quote that has circulated most widely. I'm telling you what he said and how he said it, and how completely he believed it himself. Whether that belief corresponded to anything real, I have no way of knowing. And frankly, it doesn't matter to me nearly as much as the fact that he needed me to know he wasn't afraid, that whatever was coming, he'd already made his peace with it in a way specific and complete enough that he felt he knew exactly when it would arrive. Roger Taylor and John Deacon have never publicly confirmed direct knowledge of this specific conversation, and Brian has indicated, across the interviews where this story has come up, that he does not believe Freddie shared this particular claim with anyone else, understanding it instead as something offered specifically and exclusively to him during that particular September afternoon. A detail that aligns with a broader pattern documented across several similar stories from this period, Freddie apparently distributing different specific pieces of private testimony to different individual members of his closest circle, rather than sharing identical information uniformly across the entire group. This pattern of individualized private disclosure, when considered across the accumulated body of similar stories from Freddie's final months, suggests something coherent about how he apparently approached the specific and difficult task of saying goodbye to the people closest to him, choosing not a single collective farewell, but a series of individually tailored private exchanges. Each one apparently calibrated to what Freddie understood about that specific person's own particular needs and capacity to carry whatever specific piece of testimony he chose to offer them. Brian's role in this broader pattern appears to have involved receiving the specific claim of precise foreknowledge, information paired with an explicit instruction to withhold its actual content. A combination that has left Brian carrying, across more than 3 decades since, not simply a memory of the conversation itself, but an ongoing active responsibility to maintain the same specific boundary Freddie originally established, keeping the actual date private even while acknowledging, in general terms, that such a date was claimed to exist. The psychological weight of this particular responsibility, carrying knowledge of a specific claimed fact while permanently withholding its actual content, differs meaningfully from other forms of discretion documented among Freddie's closest circle. Most other examples involving the protection of information whose content, while private, could theoretically be described in general terms without necessarily revealing every specific detail, whereas Brian's situation regarding this particular date involves a piece of information that is, by its very nature, either fully disclosed or not disclosed at all. A specific calendar date admitting no meaningful middle ground of partial revelation. Brian has described, in the interviews where he has addressed this ongoing responsibility, a specific private ritual he has apparently maintained across the decades since Freddie's death. An internal acknowledgement that occurs, according to his own account, on a date he has never specified, some particular day each year that Brian treats with private significance separate from the widely known and publicly commemorated date of Freddie's actual death on November 24th, a second private date that Brian has indicated exists and that he marks internally without ever explaining to anyone, including apparently his own family, why that particular day carries the specific weight it does for him. Whether this privately marked date represents the actual date Freddie originally claimed to know back in September 1991, whether it represents some other date entirely connected to a different aspect of their friendship that Brian has simply never chosen to publicly discuss, or whether Brian's vague references to an unspecified private date of significance represent something closer to a poetic gesture toward the general mystery of the original conversation, rather than a literal claim about an actual, currently observed, private ritual, remains, like nearly every other specific detail of this story, entirely dependent on Brian's own carefully limited public testimony, offered in fragments across different interviews without ever coalescing into anything resembling complete disclosure. The broader significance of this particular story, beyond its specific and largely unverifiable central claim, lies in what it suggests about the particular quality of trust and protection that appears to have characterized Freddie Mercury's closest friendships during his final months, a willingness among the people around him to accept and carry forward pieces of private testimony without full understanding, or even, in some cases, full belief in their objective accuracy, simply because the person offering that testimony needed, for reasons specific to his own process of facing death, to share something and have it protected exactly as he requested. Brian May has carried, by his own account, a claimed date for more than 3 decades, a piece of information he has never revealed, never confirmed against the actual date of Freddie's death, and never fully explained even in terms of why Freddie might have believed he possessed such specific knowledge in the first place. This sustained discretion, extending across more than 30 years of subsequent public life, during which Brian has discussed nearly every other aspect of Freddie's final months, with considerable openness across numerous interviews and public appearances, represents, according to people who have studied the broader pattern of testimony from Freddie's inner circle, One of the more remarkable examples of a single specific detail being protected with total and unwavering consistency across an otherwise extensively documented and widely discussed friendship. A small sealed fragment of private knowledge existing permanently within an otherwise largely open and well-chronicled historical record. Freddie Mercury's specific reasoning for withholding the date, according to Brian's account of that September conversation, centered on protecting Brian from the particular psychological burden of counting down toward a known endpoint rather than simply remaining present for whatever time actually remained, a specific act of protective care that aligns coherently with the broader documented pattern of Freddie's behavior across his final months, his consistent apparent priority of managing the emotional experience of the people around him, even while managing his own approaching death. Whether Freddie's claimed knowledge of a specific date reflected some form of genuine intuitive awareness, a psychological narrative he constructed to help himself process his own mortality with a specific sense of control and completion, or some combination of both, remains entirely unknowable, existing now only as a claim relayed through Brian's own careful and deliberately incomplete testimony. A story that Brian has chosen to share in general outline while protecting its single most specific and most easily verifiable detail with the same absolute consistency he has apparently maintained since the original conversation first occurred in a Montreux recording studio during one of the final months when both men still had the chance to sit together, guitar and voice both quieter than they had once been, discussing exactly how much time remained and exactly how completely one of them had already made peace with whatever that answer actually was.